Thank you for joining us on episode 31 of the Hail Mary podcast. I'm Atos, and as always, I'm joined by my husband, the Toes. We're back to recap the recent NFL Draft and throw some Hail Mary shots downfield for our listeners to love or hate. Before we dive into the Roadrunners' performance at the draft, you were there in person on day 2. Why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about your experiences there?
Yeah, so a friend of mine essentially was going to announce the day 2 picks for the Tennessee Titans, and it was a great invite, obviously, but I've always kind of looked at the UTSA athletics, and at times you go to some of the events and it just seems like they're a little chaotic, and I thought that this would be a different experience, and it was at a grander scale, and it was about the same. So it's not necessarily just a UTSA thing. I think it's like pretty much any athletics, department, any other team. And so just to give some background here, because we were with a friend of mine that was doing this, we got to go in through where the presenters go through in the back entrance, and going through that security line, it was just you just got kind of pulled through, and it was weird because we haven't really said this too much on the podcast, but I'm diabetic, so I have an insulin pump, and so especially during if you go through the airport screening, sometimes it sets off security. Mm-hmm. So as I was being pulled, I was afraid that I was going to set it off, but it was also kind of just weird seeing many of the presenters that went on stage for the draft were back there, and they were just kind of waiting for their credentials to get in. Mm-hmm. I don't know, some of them may have just walked there or something, because it was just bizarre. It was like this just remote area in the back where people would just all of a sudden go in. If you pass by it, you may not notice it or blink, and think it's nothing, but it was the entrance. So anyway,
you kind of expect that with the NFL that this would be like a well-oiled program, right? Everything would be running on time.
It's
very,
not their first
very
draft.
Organized. Yeah, it's not like this is the first time, and it's not the first time they've done it in Vegas either.
Right. So it was just bizarre, and you kind of think of UTSA and how young they are, and so when they're disorganized, sometimes you're like, well, this is still new to them as well.
It's not like you're paying an event planner either at UTSA, right? I mean, you have somebody that's probably not their day job that's helping out or what have you. But
yeah, and
the NFL, you expect it to be a professional experience.
You're getting a lot of interns that are kind of running around with their chickens with their head cut off, because they're just scrambling around. They're like, oh my God, it's Josh Charles. I need to get his credentials. Here's whoever, and YouTube stars that obviously I don't know, but apparently I was next to, and it was just nuts. So yeah, I mean, finally got back there, and we were able to be in sort of the hospitality area. So that's where I spent the entire draft essentially on day 2. It was a cool experience. I mean, got to see. I saw Carly Lloyd. I should have gone up and gotten a picture. I didn't. I really regret that now. But otherwise, got to meet the Miz. If anybody knows out there, the wrestler, the Miz, really nice guy. He was. We were trying to talk him into talking a little trash about the Browns. He kind of went up there and just really hammed it up, but he seemed to inject some energy into the crowd, and so that was really cool. But again, really nice guy. Really cool experience. I don't know if this will ever happen again, but just fantastic.
Trying to influence some people too as well to maybe call Tariq's name, see if you could get him.
Yes, I am guilty of that. I will say that many people did see the UTSA hat, and at times would stop me, and they're like, hey, they either mentioned Tariq or they just talked about the team overall and just how good they were this past season. So that was really cool too. I mean, sure, you would imagine seeing that from maybe a UTSA fan that you might just run into there, but these were random people that just either had other pro team jerseys on, or they just had polos on with nothing on them, and just come up to you and just hey.
Yeah, the fact that they can recognize the logo now and not think that it's the Baltimore Ravens or something.
Right. It was again just a kind of weird experience in a good way though, because of the fact that at least there's some recognition now.
Cool. All right, well, let's get into talking about the Roadrunners. So for the first time in program history, UTSA had 2 players drafted. It was a bit of a surprise, though, because Spencer Burford was selected first. He was in the 4th round, 134 pick. He was selected by the 49ers. The initial kind of draft projections had him pretty solidly in the 5th round. That was kind of, overall where you started to see him consistently. So to see him go in the 4th round and before Tariq was a bit of a surprise. What were your thoughts on that?
I think there was some emphasis on trying to find some linemen, and Spencer's going to a very good organization. And I think that's the important part here, is that if our guys are getting drafted, we do want to see them going to some good organizations,
because we want to see them end up on the roster,
and succeed, really. And I think that these good organizations will help them succeed. If you got a chance to see some of like the call that was made to Spencer from their GM and from, I think it's John Lynch and Kyle Shanahan, it was, they seemed genuinely excited. It sounded like they really knew what he was like, and I think I don't see them as guys that overdraft players. They usually find, running backs or other players deep in a draft, and they value each pick. So Spencer going at 4th, I think, is big, and I think he does make the roster. I think he's really got a good chance there.
What I really liked about him talking about that phone call was that he said in one of the interviews that his cousin was making a taco run, and he was on the phone with a cousin trying to finalize the order when the call came in. It was like, how Puro San Antonio is that?
Yeah.
It's a perfect San Antonio experience, yeah.
Good way to represent the university.
Absolutely, in the city. So then Tariq Woolen was selected in the 5th round with the 153rd pick by the Seattle Seahawks. A bit of a surprise here again, because Tariq's projections were sort of all over the place.
Right.
Initially they were lower in the draft, and then kind of as we got really after the combine in particular, and his speed at the combine was talked about by so many different people, you started to see him sneak further and further up in the draft projections, with most of them landing somewhere in the 2nd and 3rd round. So after that day when, his name didn't get called and he fell past the 4th round, I think some people started to get a little bit nervous or concerned. I'm sure Tariq probably did too. It was probably, 2 of the most anxious days of his life, I'm guessing.
Right.
So what are your thoughts on why he fell to the 5th round?
Well, if you take your Roadrunner glasses off, you have to realize that he didn't have much tape, because he's only been playing cornerback for a very short time period. He's a raw product. And that's the other part to this. Much like Marcus before him, the reason that he was being kind of talked, I think, higher than he was taken was because of the fact that, there's a lot of promise there. And the fact that he's so athletic, so fast, so tall, it starts blinding you. And before you know it, there's always going to be people that are going to start telling you, hey, I think you're going to go in this round, and so you should declare for the draft, or you should do this. So, I think once you took off the Roadrunner glasses, you're like, okay, here's what we're truly seeing with Tariq. How is this going to affect his draft stock? And we saw it. The fact is, there were a lot of cornerbacks that were being taken that were projected well after him, because they had more tape, because they didn't have an injury history, So I think without him being such a freak athlete, he may have actually fallen out of the draft, or at the very least, maybe gone seventh round or something. It's just the way the NFL works. And I've seen many people say this before, but many GMs overthink the draft too. They just all of a sudden they have a list of players that they want, have a list of guys that they think that they're going to be taking, and then the day of the draft, it's like their brain freezes and they're like, no, I'm going to take this guy instead. Our need is on the offensive line, but you know what? We're going to take 8 receivers for whatever reason. So,
yeah, it seemed like perhaps these teams were looking at him as, absolutely looking at his speed, looking at his height, his athleticism, but also considering him to be a project, and they didn't seem to want to overpay, if you will, for the fact that they're going to have to invest a lot of, time and development in him.
Yeah, that's fair. 2nd or 3rd round pick is going to get more money, and so if you're going to be a project, they'd rather get you cheap and say, hey, if we could turn you into something, then you're welcome. You're going to make your most money to me in your second and third NFL contracts. Specifically your second one, because that's when you really have been able to at least show this is the type of player I am. This is the work ethic, I have. And so, that's when teams really get a better idea of who you are. So,
what are your overall thoughts in terms of him being on the roster in the future with the Seahawks?
I think they got a shot. I mean, they're going to be bad next year. And that's not like a hit to Tariq that he's going, that he's going to make the team because it's a bad team. It's the fact that they don't have a quarterback. Mm-hmm. Drew Lock is not a franchise quarterback. So the fact that they're saying we're sticking with him, but we're going to we added a bunch of pieces around the offense. We added some pieces on defense. Is saying we're not going to be very good next year, but the year after we're going to get our quarterback. And then just watch us soar. We're going to be better. Plus, we're going to have this stack up all this talent around the offense and the defense. And, we're going to have a good young team to start building. So
potentially more time for him to develop and less pressure,
I would say so. I mean, you're not having to worry about playing on a contending team and having to, have the pressure of making the playoffs. They're not going to be trying to make the playoffs.
So after the draft, of course, we had kind of talked a little bit about there might be a dark horse that gets drafted in the third round. But really our assessment anyways going in was we thought 2 players getting drafted was probably where we were going to end up. As soon as the draft ends, though, that's when all of the frenzy starts with the undrafted free agents. I was personally starting to get a little bit nervous as I was watching, Twitter after the draft because as I've talked about before, I'm an Iowa State fan, and I follow, their Twitter accounts and, some of the reporters that cover Iowa State, and I was seeing tweets flying around left and right with all of these different Iowa State players that were getting picked up in the draft. It was almost like they were the Tickle Me Elmo from, the Black Friday, 10, 15 years ago. Like, they were just flying off the shelves, and I wasn't seeing anything from UTSA. And so I was really kind of starting to get a little bit nervous about what was going on with our guys, but in hindsight, I also wonder too, how much of the communication was happening behind the scenes between some of these guys that were getting looked at for free agent contracts and UTSA, just because we haven't had, that many people get undrafted free agent contracts. And really, this is the first time in the trailer era. So maybe there was just some communication issues there.
Yeah. So this is just new to UTSA. The fact that, we talked about an event planning portion where, there's some growing pains there. Where there's some growing pains here as well, where they're trying to get verification. They're trying to figure out, who do they need to talk to? And so, yeah, I think it's fair to compare UTSA to Iowa State, but we're also going to have to realize that it's going to be
it's a whole different world.
Yeah, a whole different world now.
Yeah, so ultimately, we did end up hearing that night that a couple of players had signed undrafted free agent contracts. First being Charles Wiley, who signed with the Ravens. What were your thoughts on Charles Wiley?
Well, I think that he probably impressed with the way he interviewed. I mean, we talked about it a few times, both on the podcast and off the podcast, was just how well spoken he was when being interviewed, pre-games, after practice, whatever. Like, he looked polished, and you could tell that, maybe the talent might not be at the overwhelming level where he's going to definitely be drafted, but at the very least, he was going to get looks. And I think interviews were also going to push him over the edge to say, like, this guy can communicate, he comes off polished. We're going to get, take a chance on him. And again, here's another great organization, the Ravens, who are, taking a chance on Charles Wiley, and it makes sense. I mean, I think a lot of linebackers are really being overlooked because most of these teams now, because it's a passing league, they're really focusing on the defensive line and looking at the secondary. So linebackers are kind of getting overlooked, and this may be a chance for Charles to, kind of hook on.
Right. And from all accounts, he really did impress at his pro day as well. One of the other ones that we heard about on draft night was Clarence Hicks getting picked up by the Bengals. Interestingly, read an article about them, and they talked about really when they were looking for their undrafted free agents on the defensive side, they were really looking for athleticism. And they seem to really like Clarence Hicks' athleticism and pass rushing ability.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think also, again, once you look at a team like the Bengals, they made it over to the Super Bowl, but their linebackers were bad. Like, they really didn't have good linebackers. So, it seemed like they had decent defensive line, a decent secondary. So here they are trying to, like, start beefing up that linebacking core, and here's a chance. I mean, they need a pass rusher, and Clarence Hicks seems perfect to be just a cheap option to bring in and see if he can be a nice, maybe third down, maybe just guy that maybe can find a role on the team. And, I think Clarence can do it.
When we had initially gone into kind of our discussion about the draft, those were two of the guys that we had, identified as someone that we expected to get an undrafted free agent contract. But we always said there would probably be some kind of dark horse, and we weren't exactly sure who that dark horse would be. It turns out it was Leroy Watson. Interestingly, instead of signing an undrafted free agent contract as a tight end, he signed a contract as an offensive lineman with a swing tight end, or as a swing tight end with the Falcons. So a little bit of a position change, although I think just kind of looking at Leroy Watson and the way that he's been used at UTSA, in some ways he really played as a lineman anyways.
Yeah, I mean, that's what Frank Wilson brought him in to do anyway. He was a blocking tight end. And so here's this big dude that, again, just like Oscar, we essentially had a couple extra linemen. So, it really helps the running game. It helps the passing game, with having them pass block. So, maybe this is just a way to raise our eyebrows now and say Oscar may have a shot at the, at the NFL because of the fact that Leroy's kind of paving the way here. So good to see him, join the team.
Yeah. And one of the other surprises of the night, I think, was the fact that we didn't instantly hear about Sincere McCormick getting a free agent contract. Most people either expected that he would, if he got drafted maybe in the 7th round, or if he didn't, that he would get picked up very quickly with a free agent contract. And that wasn't what happened. Initially, the first report that came out was that he got a minicamp invite to Seattle. And it was a couple of days later before, it finally came through that he got the opportunity as an undrafted free agent with the Raiders. So what do you think happened over that time period with Sincere McCormick? Like, how did he drop from being a potential 7th round draft prospect to really having to wait down the wire to get an opportunity to be an undrafted free agent?
Well, first of all, there was no running back taken in the first round.
Right.
Breece Hall was the highest running back taken. He was in the 2nd round. So immediately I started telling you, this running back class either isn't really sparkling or there's just no one that's really popping. And that's one of the things we talked about in the last episode was, with Sincere, there's really nothing that really popped. Like, there wasn't something, the speed wasn't special. Height wasn't really special. It's just...
He did have, like, the athleticism kind of freak athlete thing that Tariq had.
Right. So that didn't really cause that buzz. And so, at least with him, it just seemed like it was more of a, he's a good player. But, we can find a bunch of good players. Like, so, to me, I've always harped on the fact that, his pass blocking wasn't too great. We've harped on, the speed as well as we kind of talked about. So, it's those little things that, I think looking forward now, I think he just needs to work on those skills, especially the pass blocking. Like, if he can be a good pass blocker, he can find a niche on any team. Any team will be able to say, if you can recognize what's going on, good to go. I think that, he can at the very least maybe latch on for a few games. I just think it's going to be difficult because of the fact that, running backs just aren't valued too highly. I mean, he was a great UTSA player.
Great Conference USA player.
Yeah, great college player. But, sometimes, you've asked before, but you look at Heisman Trophy winners, and they usually don't do well in the NFL. Like, they're never, like, the number 1 pick. Now it's just like, oh, you won the Heisman Trophy. You'll be lucky if you make a roster, right? So, with at least with Sincere, I think we just need to take the Roadrunner glasses off and pretty much say, terrific UTSA player. Let's see how he does in the NFL. We'll cheer him on, whatever happens. But I don't think anybody should be bitter at any NFL team because of it. It's just the way he's just not in a position that is really valued.
Well, the other thing that I had read about this running back class, the things that they were looking for that Sincere didn't have an opportunity to do are, really a lot of times the running backs come in, and unless they are those top 2 or 3 running backs, they spend a lot of time on special teams. And Sincere didn't have a lot of opportunity to play special teams at UTSA because that's not what we needed. We had running backs like BJ Daniels who could fill those roles. We needed Sincere to be the workhorse. So he doesn't have that, that experience. It doesn't mean that he can't learn it or do it. But when you're looking back at his resume, that might have been something, when they got to, the level of kind of 6th round down to undrafted free agents, that may have hurt him. The other thing is that he really wasn't used very much in the receiving game, which, again, that's not a shot on Sincere. It just isn't part of how our offense operates at UTSA. We have so many weapons at wide receiver. We don't and tight end. We don't necessarily need, Sincere or Brendan Brady to be that involved, in the passing game.
And I think going back real quick to like the kickoff returns and the punt returns, we didn't have really many returns anyway. Mm-hmm. Most of the time it was a lot of fair catches.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, even if he was back there, they probably wouldn't be kicking to him anyway because you had BJ Daniels back there and everybody kicked away from BJ Daniels. I think it wasn't until the bowl game that he finally got like an opportunity to return a kick. But so, I mean, that tells you anyway. He probably wasn't going to get the opportunity, so why put him back there and risk an injury, right? So,
right, exactly.
Yeah, it certainly hurt his resume, but what can you do?
Yeah. And then, of course, Hunter Duplessis came through just recently with a mini camp invite to the Denver Broncos. So, great opportunity for Hunter. Again, mini camp invites a little bit different than being an undrafted free agent because unlike Sincere and Leroy, Clarence, and Charles, Hunter isn't going to have guaranteed money going into this camp. He's going to have a couple of days, a very narrow opportunity with stipends on those days to, be able to show them what he can do. So it's a great opportunity for him. He's got a much harder road ahead than the undrafted free agents do, but hopefully he'll have a chance to, show off what we've all seen and, maybe be able to move forward and make it to spring camp or to fall camp there. So looking back on the draft overall, what did we learn?
Well, we learned that teams are cautious of players that have, history of injuries. I mean, Nakobe Dean was a highly rated linebacker, and he fell quite a bit because of the fact that he had some sort of torn pectoral muscle, decided not to do any surgery, and because of it, I think teams just got scared of it, which I don't understand. The Cowboys took a player that essentially has a bad back and is out all of next season. Why they didn't decide to take a shot at Nakobe Dean, who, if he's good, then he just adds to a talent, they get a good talent. It's bizarre, but it's the Cowboys. At this point, Cowboys fans, just give up on them because they'll win the Super Bowl in September, but when the real Super Bowl comes around, they ain't going to be there. The wide receivers, though, were much more valued than running backs. And we kind of already started hinting at that with Sincere. Mm-hmm. There were more wide receivers that were going in the first actually the first couple of rounds than I anticipated.
Well, even, just listening on television, they were surprised by how many wide receivers were going so quickly and how the quarterbacks had, slipped.
Right. And so I think the surprise to me was the fact that some of these guys were really reaching. I mean, I won't say the Titans reached. I think that they got a cheaper version of the wide receiver they have, who's not really an all-star. He's a good receiver, but same guy, essentially, and now they get him at a cheaper price. So, okay, I mean, I'll do the same thing. I'll trade to get a couple more picks and get that guy, go somewhere else. he could have gotten more from the Titans, and he didn't. So it's bizarre. Again, like, there's all these bizarre things that are happening, but the fact that wide receivers were, to me, such a bigger commodity, again, we talked about, you just kind of mentioned it, everybody thought that it was crazy, because a lot of the mock drafts, too, were just like, and I know the mock drafts are based on somebody's best guess as to, this is what the team needs, so you're going to fill it with the player that's best at that time. I just find it interesting that there are teams that need running backs out there, but it was clear that they felt like, we're not going to waste a draft pick on that. We're going to just take a bunch of wide receivers. And honestly, I think the wide receivers are just so far ahead. They can just put a rookie wide receiver out there, and there's a good chance a lot of these guys are going to be immediately stars, because they are just, it's the type of offenses that everybody's running now. So
thinking about next year and the fact that we have, 3 or more wide receiver seniors that are going to be coming out and draft eligible potentially, JT Clark, Zachary Franklin, Josh Cephas, what does this mean for them, do you think, for next year? Does it indicate that they might have a better opportunity next year, or do you think this was just like an anomaly?
Yeah, so I'll do a Hail Mary shot and say yes. I think that opens up more opportunity for the 3 of them based on what we saw. Now, I went back and looked, and there was actually less wide receivers drafted than the year before, but you're still seeing more wide receivers and, like, really teams taking a chance on them. You also saw the fact that once you saw these wide receivers being taken early, like, all of a sudden you saw secondary guys being taken. Because who's going to match up against all these wide receivers? So if you're going to flood the field with wide receivers, you're going to need all these secondary guys. You can't have linebackers. Again, why you're starting to see linebackers not as coveted as, say, maybe a good secondary player. Hence why Tariq was getting a bunch of looks. Or a defensive pass rusher who can, make an impact and get after the quarterback. So it's really cool, though, the idea of that maybe we could top the amount of players that were drafted this year, which was, it was only 2, but it's still great for UTSA because, we could possibly have more.
One of the interesting things that came up, particularly when people were talking about Sincere, in the UTSA verse, but also just in general, as people were talking about players who left college early to go to the draft. How do you think the fact that now these guys are able to, profit on NIL, how is that going to change kind of the landscape going forward? Do you think that's really going to factor into whether a player comes back for a senior season because they can earn some money, maybe not NFL money, but money playing in college, versus, feeling like they have to chase the dollar and get into the draft earlier?
Well, let's just take Sincere here for instance. And let me ask you this question. Did you think that if he returned and maybe had let's just say, guaranteed NIL money of $100,000, do you think he would have returned?
I don't know. I don't know if he would have made that decision based on the money or not. I think in terms of, would his draft prospects have changed had he come back a 4th year? I think he probably would have ended up in the very same place, assuming that these factors with how the draft went with wide receivers, etc., and, having a similar types of running backs that he's competing with, I think he probably would have ended up in a very similar spot. Now, would he have said, I'm going to take $100,000 NIL deal versus the chance to make $1 million, in the NFL? I don't know. I think he probably would have gambled just based on likely the feedback that he was given, unless, he's been given feedback that, hey, you're probably going to go undrafted. But I'm guessing he probably went into this thinking, I'm going to be a 6th or 7th round draft pick, and that's why I chose to leave when I did.
And I think that's what's going to be the thinking going forward. You're going to take a chance on yourself going into the NFL. Forget the NIL money. You're going to take a chance. The only way somebody, I think, comes back is if, they don't have any sort of opportunity, I think, to go to the NFL. Or
they expect to be undrafted.
But like what you said, if you've got people whispering in your ear that, and we've heard this from many people around every single football organization, in terms of like college football. They say, these agents start coming around because they want to sign these guys, and so they start kind of whispering in their ear that, hey, we think you're going to be a fourth rounder, we can get you whatever. Mm-hmm. So with all these promises that are being made, I mean, forget the NIL money. I mean, the NIL money is going to be nice for the freshman, sophomore, as they sort of like kind of first come in, because you're coming in as a freshman and sophomore and think that, maybe you could make $10,000 this year. Like, that would have been big for me. Like if I,
I mean, it also differs by schools, right? Some of these P5 schools are getting 6-figure NIL deals or 7-figure NIL deals. That's not necessarily the landscape at the G5 level for most programs.
Right, but my point really is the fact that, they have an opportunity, and there's dollar signs. Somebody's going to jump at that. And, the guaranteed or bigger dollar signs and the opportunity to play at the highest level is the NFL. So I still think guys are they're not going to worry about the NILs. Because something you had broached before was, what happens if a 5-star, or let's just say a 3-star, comes to UTSA, sign an NIL deal, and it's guaranteed like let's say $20,000 a year. What happens if like that first season, like they don't do well? Like, and what kind of guarantee do they have that NIL deal that they agreed to like has to keep paying them? Like, there's nothing that says that they could stop from paying them. So there's these kids that are going to get upset. So, I just think that, NIL there's a lot of people trying now to come back and curb everything that's going on because there's a bunch of tampering, there's a bunch of all stuff happening. So I think we're going to see a change in the landscape. I think right now everybody's just freaking out because it's essentially like this
brand new,
weird kind of Wild West free market out there that people are just throwing all sorts of money at it and going, we can buy players now. Essentially, we can bring them over here by just giving them, $10,000 or whatever. So,
one other question that came up a couple of times among UTSA fans was, some of these players opted out since you're of the bowl. So since you're opted out of the bowl, Tariq opted out of the bowl. Did that hurt them when it came to their draft stock, or was that just completely irrelevant?
I think for Tariq it hurt him, but we knew Tariq was injured. I mean, I think we forget when we look at Tariq, and when he started sliding, you did see some people start kind of questioning all sorts of stuff. He was barely healthy enough to play in the conference championship game. He then got injured while he was in the conference championship game. To try to suck it up again about 2.5 weeks later, didn't seem realistic. I mean, we talked about it. We're like, he's not. There's no reason for him to. He was on the team that won the championship. He got that.
And it probably would have gotten, or potentially could have gotten worse, his injury.
Correct.
Had he played.
Right. So,
if he was healthy, then, your thought is, yeah, he should have played.
Yeah, if he was fully healthy, but we knew he wasn't. And that's what my point here is, we forget that. All of a sudden, we're way past, now we're in April, and we just forget that he was injured, during that time. Sincere, it wasn't going to gain anything. We already talked about him even coming back next season. There was nothing to gain. I think the two of us had a good thought that he was not coming back for his senior season. We knew that, hey, as a running back, you've got so much wear on you that you've got to go out as fresh as possible. So, he took a shot. Like we've already talked about, it didn't seem to work out. Oh, well.
It's still undetermined if it worked out. It didn't work out in terms of getting drafted, but, he still has an opportunity.
Yeah, but really, he was going to have a shot. Mm-hmm. Some of these other guys, you kind of scratch your head, you're getting ready for pro day, or, you kind of say that, but you know that there was other factors behind the scenes that, they weren't going to air any of that, but you had an idea. Something's going on with them, cool, whatever. At this point, I think for everybody just kind of going back and harping on that, just, you need to get over it. Everybody's got a decision to make. You choose to go to work every day. Whether you choose to go or not, that's on you, because you're sick, you're not sick, you just want to play hooky, whatever. These guys decided, we went through this whole season, and it was a long season. This is the longest season that UTSA has had. So at the end of it, again, we were frustrated because we wanted that bowl win, but what we want as fans is totally different than what these players want, and so
in terms of their long-term career, right?
So they made their choice. Oh well.
Before we go, let's talk about the big roster news that we've had recently. Brady is back.
Sure, I think in theory it sounds good, but he's had injuries throughout like the last couple seasons, so you're hoping that this last season that he's able to be healthy throughout the season. But whatever, it's his decision. Once again, just like we talked about in the previous segment, like it's his decision. He wants to come back. Good for him. I'm hoping that he stays healthy throughout the season. But
because if he does, I mean, absolutely, this is going to help that depleted running back room to have. First of all, just his leadership there, but hopefully, he gets to have that healthy season that we've all been, hoping for, because he has a lot of potential and he's always been a really good player. But, we've just had these circumstances that have come up that have kept him from being able to live up, to that potential.
And as much as, we talked about how deep this team was at times, like the running back room wasn't very deep, shown by the fact that Sincere was a workhorse the last 2 seasons. Mm-hmm. He was the guy that mostly ran the ball. So, they rarely brought in anybody else to run the ball. So, we missed Brendan Brady there when he was injured. And
we were lucky, though, that he was the 2 games that Sincere was not at, we had a healthy Brendan Brady, and we got to see what that could have looked like.
I mean, you saw it against Illinois last season, their first game, where, he essentially scored the winning touchdown. And, it's just, you see those moments and you're like, I would just wish he would have been able to be healthy throughout the season, because Sincere would have had less carries with, a little bit less wear and tear. So we'll see what happens. But, it certainly does help that running back room.
And if you haven't seen it, John Harris interviewed Brendan Brady. You can find the interview on Twitter. If you go to Brendan Brady's dad's Twitter site, Andre Brady, he has the interview, so you can go back and watch it. It was interesting because Brendan said that Coach Traylor had come out to Steele to recruit, and Brendan's mom works at Steele. They started to have a conversation about the potential of Brendan coming back, and then, mom talks to Brendan, and he said ultimately he couldn't say no twice to Traylor. So I guess for those of you that are very excited, like I am, that Brendan's coming back, you can thank his mom. And other roster news, the deadline for the transfer portal to be eligible in the fall was May 1st. So far, it seems like UTSA has been unscathed. We haven't seen anybody pop up in the transfer portal. I mean, I guess there's a potential that maybe somebody could drop in tonight. They had the deadline of May 1st, but compliance sometimes takes a couple of days to review those before they actually hit the official portal. So there's a potential that we might see a name pop up, but it seems like if anybody had entered the transfer portal prior to that deadline, likely we would know about it by now. So
we lost so many guys that there's just so many spots open that I think that we're going to be fine. If not, then that's something to go into the summer with. But I don't anticipate anybody coming through on the transfer portal.
One other thing, for those of you that want to go onto Twitter, you can check and see UTSA Athletics recently honored student athletes at the Rowdies this week. So they had a couple of different awards that were given out, things like Moment of the Year, which they awarded to the game-winning touchdown against UAB to claim the West. The Toves highlight of the season last year.
Yep.
Coach of the Year went to Coach Traylor. Upset of the Year went to the baseball team for their 6-5 win over number 2 Stanford. Outstanding Athletes of the Year, Sincere McCormick, Marina Estelle in softball. I'm going to probably pronounce this name wrong, but Ingberg Grunwald in track and field. So you can check those out.
I think she's a long jumper, but yeah.
Yeah, you can check out the rest of the award list. There's way too many to go through on UTSA's website and their Twitter site. Thanks again for joining us on the Hail Married podcast. I'm Toves.
And I'm the Toves.
We'll be back this summer to gear up for another season of UTSA football.
Birds up.